Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring something that sounds like an oxymoron: selling compliance. After all, compliance, as the name implies, is something that is forced on employees. It's the antithesis of sales, where the activity involves somebody working to persuade someone else of the merits of their product and service. Someone who works in sales is unlikely to have any desire to work in compliance, and vice versa. So it might surprise you to hear that my guest on this episode, Taylor Edwards, works in, wait for it, compliance sales. Taylor works for Broadcat, and probably the world's only compliance design company that creates tools that makes compliance more engaging and more effective. I've had Broadcat's founder Ricardo Pelafone on the show before. Links to those episodes are in the show notes. As you'll hear, Taylor's background's in sales, and when he joined Broadcat earlier this year, he needed to learn about compliance because that's who the company's customers are. In doing so, he discovered that while sales and compliance might seem like different disciplines, there's much they have in common. By bringing a sales lens to the business of compliance, Taylor has some really interesting insights to share for anyone managing human risk. They're also relevant if you're someone working in sales who has to do so in a heavily regulated environment. If you're finding compliance is stifling what you do, then you might be able to help your compliance function be more sales friendly. Now, since Taylor works in sales, he's incredibly engaging, so I know you're going to enjoy my discussion with Taylor Edwards on selling compliance. Taylor, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. And I think, look, to start with, can you just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, you bet. So I'm a salesperson by background. I've been at Broadcat, which is how we met for the last several months. But prior to that, I've run sales or I've been a part of sales for a couple of different companies. I started out in the startup space, so a brand new burgeoning venture capital-backed startup company, and I was the first full-time sales rep, boots on the ground sales rep that they hired. Did that for several years. I've moved on. I kind of wanted to try out the large corporate space a little bit more, like enterprise sales, a big established company that doesn't have fires to put out every 5 seconds like the startup did. And so did that, joined another company, one of the largest tech companies in the world, and sold for them for a while, doing employee experience programs. So that involved working with HR teams, IT teams, designing these overarching employee feedback, data analysis, and things like that, to better support kind of the employee journey. It didn't take me too long to figure out that I actually preferred the small startup environment where there are a lot of fires to put out, but you have a little bit more autonomy than you might in a corporate setting. And so before long, I got put in touch with Ricardo, the founder, the CEO of Broadcat. We hit it off pretty well and joined the company. And so now I've moved into this ethics and compliance space, and I sell to compliance teams.
So you are literally in compliance sales.
That's right. Yeah, I think that'd be an accurate way to put it.
Which, if you asked anyone in either capacity, right, that would sound like an oxymoron. Right?
Sure.
So you're basically helping. So you're selling products that help compliance people to be better at their job, so they can focus on the things and supporting them with those. And we'll put links to that in the show notes.
Sure.
And I'm fascinated by that transition because you're on the one hand, like, people are people. Mm-hmm. And selling to them is one thing, but you've had to accumulate a whole host of sort of skills and experiences and understand a whole new marketplace.
Yeah,
that has required you to shift. And I think, and that's why I wanted you on the show, because I think you've got fascinating insights. One, around a salesperson's perspective of compliance, but secondly, shifting into how do I think about selling to compliance? How do I talk to that audience? So you are the perfect person, if you like, to bridge the gap between what are in extremis two very I would say alien species. Well, I just have, but it's kind of like, so on the one hand, you've got people who are motivated to sell stuff. On the other hand, you've got people that don't want bad things to happen.
Right.
And those seem in conflict. So I'm fascinated by your sort of thoughts on that experience and what you've learned as you've gone.
Yeah, absolutely. It has certainly been an interesting experience. And each of my roles that I've had previously have kind of taken me somewhere into like new territory, right? So that startup I talked about, it was a very niche space where it was multifamily real estate, very specific targeted industry. I only worked in one industry, right? And that had all sorts of nuance and kind of strange quirks that you might experience selling in that market, and then moved within technology, but now across multiple industries. When it came to employee experience programs, that has relevance across manufacturing to tech to to consulting to whatever it is.
Anywhere that's got employees, basically.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And so that had some changes on its own, and then moving into now once again a little bit more specialized, where sure the industry, virtually any industry will have some compliance needs, but having a very specific buyer on the other end of the table, a compliance officer, has definitely been an interesting experience. There are certain things that are always the same when it comes to sales, and that would be typically most people don't want to talk to salespeople. No matter who it is you're talking to, most people don't like picking up the phone and finding a salesperson at the other end of the phone. So things like that would be the same. But certainly some of the differences would be, I think it has been interesting to note how a little bit it seems like compliance teams are maybe a little bit more removed from the buying process compared to a lot of other parts of the organization. Right. There's a little bit less of that motion of flexing that muscle that goes on there than it does elsewhere. So that's been interesting. But I think one other thing that maybe I'd tie off with on this front would just be there is also a lot of similarity in the sense that in sales, I'm trying to find someone that is a good fit for what I'm offering, right? It certainly is not the case that every single person needs what I'm selling, no matter where it is I'm selling it. But I'm trying to find that person, and then I'm trying to align and kind of get all parties aligned on, okay, what's the right best path forward, and then guide all of us to that end path. In the case of sales, it typically means signing a contract, having someone join as a customer of your company. In compliance, it's similar, except you're trying to find those people, right, the employees, and align on best practices and like what the right course of action is to do, and you're trying to influence behavior. And in those ways, there's actually a lot of similarities that I think a lot of compliance people might not necessarily think about initially, or maybe wouldn't even agree with me on. But I certainly see similarities in sales and what I see from compliance teams needing to do within their own organizations.
That's really interesting. You've had to get to grips with what are the challenges facing compliance people. And the thing I find fascinating is that you've been sharing that journey on social media, talking about some of these dynamics that you've spotted and really helping to bridge that gap. So taking a salesperson's perspective and thinking, what did I think about compliance? And therefore, if what you're basically doing is representing the ultimate target audience of the people that you're speaking to, because you're saying, look, if you're in a business, a salesperson is a good proxy for the average employee that is trying to do something where they're not waking up in the morning and going, compliance is my number one priority. They're going, I need to hit a target. I've got something I'm employed to do, and there's a whole lot of other stuff I need to think about as I do that, but I'm not waking up, living and breathing compliance. And you've been making that transition and saying, actually, I'm now talking to a community that has to speak to the former me. And I guess to a certain extent, the current you, right? Given clearly, if given what you do, there is a compliance element to what you do. But broadly speaking, you're acting. You've made a transition, and you can act as an interesting advocate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the beginning of this year, I thought, hey, I would like to start sharing more of this on social media and sharing that perspective. Because for my first few months at Broadcat, I openly admitted to a lot of people that were at the other end of the call, other end of the table, to say, hey, listen, I have historically been a good employee, right? Most managers would give me high reviews for a performance management system. I generally be put as like a top performer, that kind of a thing. And I got to admit, I've never read my company's code of conduct. And yet I came to Broadcat, and I heard a lot of compliance people telling me, oh, well, hey, we're really spending like the next 6 months on a code of conduct refresh or writing a code of conduct. And I would think, oh, wow, I had no idea you spent that long on it, because I've never met somebody who's read a code of conduct, let alone myself, right? So I started saying, hey, maybe this might be an interesting thing for people to hear about, is someone outside of compliance now come to the compliance world and to start sharing those experiences. So I remember I posted one item kind of at near the beginning of the year, and I got one response in particular that was from a former coworker of mine. They actually helped train me at my old company, and they would have been they were really high performer. They did very well in their role, and their comment was, "Well, Taylor, you're thinking about compliance training the wrong way. Compliance training is just shifting liability from the company to the employee." And that to me was like a trigger in my head that said, okay, I'm not the only one, right? This is confirming what frankly, what I've already heard before and what I already thought myself, that the way a lot of teams operate kind of reinforces to your day-to-day employees that compliance is just there to check the box. We're just trying to transfer liability to you, the employee, and we just want to get through this as much as you want to get through it, right? And so then I started thinking, okay, I'm going to start making this more of a regular exercise where I share some of these thoughts from the perspective of someone who doesn't come from this world, right? And it has been really interesting to start thinking about those comparisons between how sales teams operate and how they're measured, how their performance is measured relative to a compliance team. And yeah, it's been rewarding, but it's also been interesting to get some of the feedback from compliance teams who share either agreement or sometimes disagreement with maybe the way I think about it. So certainly a cool experience there.
And what you're talking about here really is it's almost people speaking different languages.
Yeah.
So if you looked at what does compliance mean from the perspective of the salesperson, and we can sort of push the language as far as we want on this one, but it's sort of like it's a pain in the butt, right? It's not
Right.
something I don't joyously go, woo, here's some compliance training for a compliance. But I'm not naturally predisposed to be thinking positively.
Right.
On the flip side, you've got people who are in compliance who are committed, who think it's the right thing to do. Otherwise you wouldn't be in that role, I would contend.
Mm-hmm.
And so are pitching, are selling, if you like, something that interestingly is perceived completely differently by the people. They're not necessarily buying it in the sense of actively choosing to have it, but it lands with them. And so you've got this huge disconnect. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is when you start to look at compliance as the business of influencing human decision making, you sit there and say, for those dedicated people who are trying to make compliance happen, you have to connect with those other people. Otherwise, you won't achieve your objective. You don't put training courses on that you don't want people to pay attention to. You don't write policies that you want no one to read.
Right.
And if you do, you're negligent. But generally speaking, you're trying to do the right thing.
Right.
And so what you're talking about here is a translation exercise where in many cases, there's literally a different language being used, and it's this alien stuff that's being foisted onto people from the sales perspective. And the compliance people go, I'm just trying to get them to do these things.
Right.
And what you've done is straddled that gap. And so what you're talking about here is bridging that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give maybe an example of that, comparing that once again to sales. If you follow any number of like sales thought leaders on LinkedIn, on social media, or you go to conferences, whatever it is, there will almost always be, every day someone is going to post something on social media, or at a conference, somebody will talk about this idea of meeting buyers where they are. Right. So as a salesperson, if I want someone to answer my email, if I want someone to take my phone call, if I want someone to engage in a sales conversation with me, I have to stop talking about my product and how cool it is, right? Whatever it is, whether it's Broadcat or anything else, that's just a general practice for sales. I have to stop talking about that because I might think so, but it might have zero relevance for the person at the other end of the table. So I have to, from my very first exposure to them or my very first interaction with them, I have to, in a very short amount of time, try and get them to understand why I think this is relevant to them and get them to confirm it, right? And then we can start to have a dialogue and we can explore whether or not the product that I'm selling is actually a good fit for them. Sometimes it will be, sometimes it won't be. But, so similarly, compliance needs to then meet the commercial employees, the other employees outside of legal, compliance, risk, things like that. They need to meet them where they are and show them how it's relevant, or help them understand why it's important to engage with them for a short period of time, right? And then, if they're interested, they can learn more or whatever it is. For instance, you can refer them to the policy or to the code of conduct if they're interested in more. But if I just try and get someone to read a novel about Broadcat, they're never going to do it. Same with if you just try and get someone to read the novel that is many codes of conduct, then it's never going to happen either. And so, I like the term that you use of bridging that gap. And I think to get a little bit more specific with that analogy is you have to go to the other end of the bridge and then build it backwards, right? You can't meet them in the middle because they're not interested in.
They're not building a bridge, right?
Exactly. They're doing something else entirely. You're trying to convince them to come build a bridge with you. And so you've got to go all the way to their end and then lead them along the way. That's what sales has to do. That's exactly what compliance has to do as well in order to get any sort of attention or buy-in or changed behavior from sales employees, finance, whoever it is, right? Leadership, those who hold a lot of risk to the organization, you present a lot of risk to the organization, that you have to meet them where they are and then guide them along the way.
And it occurs to me that sales is probably at the toughest end of the spectrum, because actually, if you think about what sales are doing, right, they're attuned to this stuff. Mm-hmm. So you can't, if you're any good at sales, you'll have a sense of people, you'll have a sense of how they operate, how you communicate a message.
Sure.
So your standards in that regard are generally going to be higher, right? Mm-hmm. So my argument would always be, if you're coming as a compliance person and you're trying to get to a salesperson, this is someone who is naturally attuned to this stuff.
Right.
So don't kind of bring your F game, if there's such a thing. You need to be bringing your A game to this stuff, because these are people that spend their whole time trying to persuade other people and trying to engage with other people. So if you come with a sort of weakened offering, of course they're not going to listen to you. Whereas, and I'll demean another, whereas I'm getting maybe someone in finance as a good example isn't necessarily going to be as attuned to that, right? They're not naturally trying to persuade other people. They're just doing very important, I hasten to add for listeners who are in that space, but they're just trying to do something different. But I would argue that I think sales is a high bar to clear, because it's a really good example of where you need to not just speak their language in the sense of make it relevant to them, but they are attuned to presenting things to clients. If they want to be persuasive, want to be engaging, they know how to do that. Mm-hmm. So you need to kind of come with your, as I say, it may not necessarily be your A game, but at least your B game. But you don't want to be down to F.
Right. Yeah. Certainly. And I would even put another point to that comparison, in that sales is also an interesting discipline or job within the company, because it's one where the employee's compensation is tied so closely to their performance, right? Sales is somewhat unique in that, a lot of roles in different parts of the company will have bonuses and other kind of variable pay associated with their compensation. But sales is, hey, you have to sell deals or we don't pay you, right? And it's so easy to measure. You can boil sales performance down to a single number. How much revenue did you bring into the company? And so the reason I bring that up is to say, not only is sales accustomed to this, a good salesperson will have the emotional intelligence and things like that. And so compliance needs to bring it. But additionally, in order to get salespeople to stop focusing on, for just 1 second, to stop focusing on how do I close more business and thus get paid and keep my job, you really have to provide a lot of value to get them to stop thinking about that for a second, right? So many salespeople all over the world are just so focused on, if I don't hit my goal, if I don't hit my number, I'm fired or I don't get paid, right? And that is a whole nother thing besides, oh, I'm just really busy. Everybody is busy. I haven't met a single person in any capacity in any company who's told me I'm really not that busy. I don't have a lot going on. Everybody has said they're busy.
They're either supremely confident or supremely stupid to say that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the other thing is everybody's busy, but salespeople, it is taken to a slightly another level where you're thinking, in order to get them to stop thinking about this, I've really got to be very specific, very targeted, and very relevant with what it is I'm trying to communicate to them, what it is I'm trying to get them to do, because otherwise they're just thinking, I don't have time for this, not only because I'm busy, but also because I don't get paid if I don't do these things that I'm really busy with.
Right. So in simple terms, compliance is a massive tailwind, and
Yeah.
that's putting it loosely in terms of what they're doing.
Sure.
So there's a really good example of the sort of extremities of what you need to contend with, because you're right. You know, I always talk about compliance as being a hideous brand. So you're arriving with a terribly branded product
Right.
that is often isn't thought of in terms of being interesting and engaging. So the marketing department for compliance is never particularly great.
Sure.
And your and the branding, to the extent that people think about it, you kind of go, well, the branding matches it, right? These are the obstructive people that are here to stop me doing stuff. So there's a ton of things that make this the hardest pitch, and that's I think that's a very fair point, which is that's why if you look at, I think it's interesting to explore sales as potentially the toughest buyers, quote unquote, of your product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another thing that makes me think of is this idea of how we present information to the audience, right? So certainly there are ways to make certain training or communications fun and engaging, right? But there's also a time and place for that, and sometimes I hate being the one to break this to compliance teams, but compliance is rarely the right topic to try and make fun and engaging, because there is a level of buy-in that someone has to have in order to basically give their permission to say, yes, I'm going to allow myself to be entertained and engaged by this thing coming to me, right? And that's one of the reasons why Broadcat, for instance, or frankly any other product that services maybe compliance teams or helps compliance teams, you're not trying to brand yourself like Apple. You're not trying to make yourself look really sexy like, Apple or Google or Microsoft or something like that with sleek designs and all this cool stuff that you have to have. You're really saying, hey, this is a necessity whether we like it or not. So let's engage on it. Let's talk about it, but let's do it in an efficient way. Let's do it in a way that respects your time and your intelligence, and then we can get back to the other things that you want to spend your time on, right? But I think that's an important note too, is that not all presentation is going to be the same. Some of it is going to be dependent on the substance within, right? The thing that you are presenting about or the thing that you're communicating about.
And I want to step back to that point that you made around, you're thinking about this the wrong way, and you're not, here's something I'd never looked at myself.
Sure.
So how did you, when you sort of pick to this thing that's challenging, as you say, it needs to be pitched at the right level, in the right way, bearing in mind the situation, the context. How do you, when you look back on the world that you've come from and what you're doing now, how do you think about bridging that gap? Because you've rightly said, your compliance's worst nightmare. You were, right? Which is, he doesn't read this stuff, doesn't pay any attention. So you're a perfect example of somebody that is, I won't say seen the light, because that sort of suggests like all these people that don't get it, you're idiots, right?
Sure.
You've made the transition for understandable reasons, because you've had a reason to do that. Mm-hmm. But how do you look back and think, well, how do we start to think about engaging the former Taylor?
Yeah. So a couple of things come to mind, and I think if you asked me on different days, my answer might be a little bit different based on,
because context matters, surprisingly, right?
Yeah, exactly. Great point. And based on like the conversations I've most recently had with some prospects or some customers of Broadcat. But a couple ones come to mind. One would be making it more personal. I know that I received corporate communications about compliance at my previous company. I couldn't tell you what a single one of them ever said, because they were very clearly like HTML kind of formatted automatic emails being sent from the grand machine, corporate machine. And I had no idea who it was, right? I didn't even know at the time. I probably wouldn't have been able to say that they came from a compliance office, right? I just thought, oh, this is an internal communication. That is probably, the thought that crosses my head, and I think a lot of salespeople's minds is, oh, they're probably trying to stop bad behavior, but I'm a good employee. I don't intend to break any rules, and thus this is not relevant to me.
So this is I've got this by mistake, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're sending this out just to be careful, but I obviously don't need it, and I can self-select myself out of this pool by not paying attention to it. But rather, if something was communicated down to local leadership, it doesn't even have to be my direct manager. That could be really hard when you've got a lot of frontline managers, right? But maybe you have area vice presidents or, area leads, things like that. Just more local leadership, people who I recognize. And when they talk, I listen because I know that at some point in the chain, I report to them. And I know that they've helped me in my job previously in other capacities. So making it more personal would be a tremendous way at helping people like myself and people like me to actually perk up and give a moment's attention to this topic. And so, you can translate that to a term manager-led training, which I think would be much more effective for capturing my attention. I think there's plenty of research that supports that as well. The other thing too, and this is something we preach a lot at Broadcat, so I feel like I have to mention it, but it also resonates with me regardless of my employer, which is cut out the fat. Be ruthless. I think I've said this before. Be ruthless in eliminating content, because so much of what gets presented to not just salespeople but others when they're being trained on compliance topics is stuff that they just don't need to know. I don't need to become a lawyer in order to be compliant at my company. I don't need to know the ins and outs and the workings of the law and the abstract principles that go into forming and then upholding this law. What I need to know is, like, what are the 3 things I need to start doing, or what are the 3 things I need to stop doing in order to stay compliant for our company? And it, like, not only for the company to not get in trouble, but I don't want to get in trouble myself, right? So the incentive is there. It's just the presentation is oftentimes so poor that I don't even bother thinking about what the incentive might be for me to listen to it. So I'd say cutting out a lot of the fat goes a long way to actually getting my attention. I had a call, I think it was last week, with a group where I showed them some content, and their response was, "Well, will this be enough?" And they weren't asking me; they were actually asking their boss who was on the phone, because their fear was, I'm responsible for training, and this covers the material we need to train on, but it feels short. And I don't want to get in trouble if someone tells me that my training was too short. And the boss's response was, does this cover what we need it to cover? The answer was yes, right? And so sometimes we unnecessarily lengthen things because we feel like we need to add more. And I think we should reframe that oftentimes and think, what can I take out of here? I'm regularly trying to take stuff out of my email communications to prospects, because I know people don't want to read a long email from a stranger, or from, even if they know me, just a salesperson in general. So those would be the 2 things that come to mind to getting me before I joined Broadcat, right? Capturing my attention in where I was working previously.
And I love the depiction there, because I think you've hit on something that is, when you think about it, blindingly obvious, right? Which is, if I'm paid by someone, I'm going to look at what they're telling me to do. So if I've got someone else, someone I've never heard of with a weird department title that sound really painful, who are purveyors of tedium and bureaucracy. Right?
Sure.
I'm not exactly incentivized to go, whoa, there's another email from that gang. I'm really looking forward to reading this.
Right.
Or the people that put on that really awful training course. Oh, they want me to do another thing. Okay. So that's point 1. And then the second bit is, you sort of go, is this for my benefit or their benefit? And I love that articulation you made around, what content do I need to know? And I think there's a wonderful thing that if we look at a lot of compliance processes, it's, let's take the regulation, let's codify that into a policy. So we're good, right? We've just literally copied the regulation. And then what we'll do is we'll train people on the policy, so it all ties through. So that if something goes wrong, I can point to this beautiful flow between the outside thing that we need to worry about and what we've told them.
Right.
And of course, that, to my mind, is missing the point, because you sort of go, do you think those people would be interested in reading the regulation? No. So at which point, why are they interested in reading a kind of distillation of it?
Exactly.
Right. They want a translation. They want to be told why this is relevant and why it's interesting, because we generally don't watch movies that are in a foreign language if we don't understand it. We'll get some sense of what's going on, but it's much better with subtitles, or if it's dubbed, or at least there's some sense of someone can explain it to us. And I think when you articulate it in the way you have, it's really obvious, but this point is missed quite frequently.
Yeah. I think to put a point on that, to your point, you don't want, if there's a foreign language film, you don't want a summary of the film in that foreign language. You just want to watch it with the, like you said, with the captions on, right?
Right.
And if I can, I'd actually add one other example here that's a little bit removed from compliance, but I think it paints a similar picture to what I was describing with the familiarity, the personalization of it with manager-led training, things like that. So when I was at my previous company, that was when COVID hit and the pandemic started. Everybody started working from home, and there was all this, stuff going on. We started receiving at that time a lot more communications from our HR team. The HR teams took a little bit more of a central role within, the corporate structure and the day-to-day activities, because there was so much around, well, hey, are we going to lay people off, and how long are we working from home, and all of that stuff. Before that happened, I had no idea who my company's chief HR officer was, chief people officer, whatever you wanted to call him, and every company will be a little bit different there. But I had no idea who it was. I had no idea of anybody in that department. And you know what is particularly, now I'm actually just realizing this right now. At the time, I was selling to HR teams, right? I was selling to that part of the business, and I had no idea what that part of the business was within my own company. Now, once I got to know them, I actually started paying a lot of attention to what they were saying, not only because the content was relevant to me, right? Yeah, they were giving me updates on how long I was going to be working from home. Of course, I'm going to pay attention to that. But it went a step further. I started following our chief people officer on social media. And I started I would actually perk up when something came from, because I learned that, hey, this is actually a leader that I really respect. I like what he has to say. And so I started to not only did the content resonate with me, but I started to willingly give my attention to that person when it came to me.
Right.
And so that's another reason where, you can go kind of either direction here. You can go down and through manager-led training where it's a little bit more close to home, or you can try to highlight and kind of shine a spotlight on that part of the business so that they can get to know who is our chief compliance officer and what is it that they do, and why is it that they're asking for our attention in these training modules or in these corporate communications or whatever it is. The answer might be different for different companies, but you're certainly not getting the attention when it's someone behind an email that I have no idea, who it is, what it is they want to talk about, or like why their role is even connected or relevant to mine.
But I love that articulation around COVID and HR.
Mm-hmm.
Because what you've basically said is, you didn't put it in these terms, but suddenly they started telling me things I was interested in.
Yeah.
And so I paid more attention.
Right.
And so I kind of, they got to me because they were speaking my language, and they were probably answering questions I had or helping me navigate uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And so suddenly that becomes a much more fascinating proposition, as opposed to somebody that is talking their language and promoting their agenda. You're sitting there going, I've got enough stuff going on. I want to hear things. I will listen to the things that feel like they are going to improve my world.
Right. Yeah, and that actually plays well into a kind of a separate principle here, but something that I think is also relevant to basically reaching someone like me, that is outside of compliance, a salesperson or something
Taylor
like that.
1.0.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that would be, no matter how much you try, sometimes a topic is not going, like nobody is going to give their attention to a topic until they have kind of intrinsically discovered that it's relevant to them, right? So this will happen often in sales where you'll reach out to someone and they'll just never respond. They don't know why you're reaching out. They don't care what it is you're selling. But 6 months later, you might try them again. And this time they'll perk up and they'll say, hey, I would love to talk because we're actually in the process of evaluating people in your space, whatever it is, right? Whether it's Broadcat or anything else.
This is the equivalent of, I was someone trying to sell face masks in January 2020.
Exactly.
It's in the US or in Europe, right?
Yeah.
People go, I don't need that. Right.
Exactly.
So fine. You've got the interested parties in the medical profession and various other places that will have some of this stuff. But the average person is going, I am not wearing one of those. Why would I do that? COVID comes along magically. Oh, that's quite interesting. Yeah, I need some of those. Right.
Exactly. And they will go and seek it out. And that's where I'm always telling people, like, give me resources so that when I realize that this is relevant, I can go and do some of the research myself. Right. And so that's where it gets back to, like I said, like I never thought I was going to do anything wrong because I thought I was a good employee who wanted to follow the rules. Same with a lot of my coworkers. So we're never going to think that's relevant to us until we're in maybe a particular deal. We're working on a contract with someone and something happens and we think, oh, is this potentially like a kickback agreement, which might be problematic, right? Is this potentially some sort of bribe or something like that? In those instances, because I want to do the right thing, I will then go and actively seek out the answer. And in those cases, then compliance has my full attention because I want to make sure I can close a deal, I can get paid, and I'm not going to get in trouble. The company's not going to get in trouble. But you've got to be able to wait for those moments rather than trying to, kind of force feed it. You've got to, you can lead the horse to water, you can't make it drink, right? That's another kind of silly way of comparing it.
And that's fascinating because that flies against the logic of many compliance programs, where it's kind of we have we'll train people on a cadence that suits us. Sure. We will push things, so we won't think about those particular dynamics, but partly because they feel like they're out of control, and secondly, well, we have something they ought to be listening to, and so as a result of that, we're going to push it out on our timetable. But to your point, there may be ways of identifying a timetable that's more appropriate.
Yeah. And my only advice on that, I think, would be very simple. I would say, now think about if a salesperson thought that way towards you. In other words, if a salesperson thought, I don't care if you're not interested in this, what I have is important to you, and I'm dictating to that to you, you will never, ever engage with that salesperson, right? And so it would be really convenient for me if everybody I talked to wanted to buy my product right now. I understand that is not the case. That is never going to be the case. And so I have to engage with them on that, on their timetable at their kind of discretion. And so I think that might be a helpful way for compliance teams to compare themselves to it, to say, if a salesperson also dictated to me when they're going to give me their content, let alone me dictate to our employees when I'm going to give them the content, then that might be a helpful way of maybe scaling back or calibrating how much of that force feeding you might be doing.
And that's really interesting because if you think about, I was thinking in physical terms, right? Someone knocking on my door at home,
sure,
and kind of constantly, if they kept coming back each week with more stuff I don't want, right? At some point, even the nicest person is going to slam the door in their face or not answer.
Yeah.
But you can think about the same thing with emails. It's like there are some companies who regularly send me stuff, and I kind of go, once upon a time I was interested in X, and I kind of inadvertently signed up to their thing.
Yeah.
And there's some of them every single day.
Yeah.
And I'm like, even if it's stuff I really care about, I'm not in the mood every single day to buy something.
Right.
And I think that's a really interesting point, which is compliance is often, and I was about to say sold, but that's not how it's perceived as a sales thing. It's because people are forced buyers of it. Mm-hmm. But actually, if you started to think in those terms, you would recognize times when you are irritating. And sure, ultimately you can push it onto people, but is it going to land?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's where you'll get, if I'm really pushy, every once in a while, I will get someone who will say, hey, you've worn me down. I'm ready to talk to you. But I have also probably alienated and kind of been blacklisted by 10 other people in trying to do that to the masses. Right. And so that's where I think, going back to that example I touched on way back about one of my coworkers who commented and said, hey, you're thinking about compliance training the wrong way. It's just liability transfer and exercise. Like, they don't actually care about us. By forcing it on them the way they had, right, there might have been one employee who actually perked up and said, okay, I'm going to pay attention to this and I'm going to learn something from it. But you had 10 other employees. In my mind, I would put that closer to maybe like 100 other employees who said, oh, this is just like, they don't care about me. They're just trying to do this to check the box, and I'm just not going to pay attention to it, right? And so you've also got to weigh the comparative pros versus cons, what you're gaining versus what you're losing when you try these communications. And I think that comes a little bit more naturally to an experienced or a seasoned salesperson because they do it day in and day out, right? We're always sending out some communication, and we're always having to calibrate to say, you know what, the timing might not be right. I need to wait off on that person, right? Because there's a lot of people that will say, hey, Taylor, I'm really interested in this, but time is just not good. Let's talk in 3 months, right? That's fine. Then we're engaging on their terms and their timetable when they're interested, and not me just saying, hey, you really need to pay attention to this now. Otherwise I'm going to keep knocking on your door, like you said.
And And I also think your point around we notice the times when it lands, we don't notice the times when it doesn't.
Sure.
Is an interesting theme, I think, when we look at the broader compliance piece, because we very often focus on the bad thing we're trying to prevent. So we are trying to stop bad people from doing things. But what we don't look at is what impact is that having on the average person who's good. So you can constantly send out reminders because you're targeting that one individual who, by the way, I think if you keep reminding, they're probably not listening to you anyway, but even if they were, this barrage of stuff isn't going to make any difference. But what you're simultaneously doing, which you're not thinking about, is irritating a ton of other people. And it's not just the impact of that one thing, because you've then labeled yourself as they're those idiots that don't understand me. Right. They're the people they don't get me. They're not, you're building that alienation piece. And I come back to the word, I've always talked about the word compliance as being a hideous piece of branding. Mm-hmm. When you're already dealing with a negative piece of branding, and then you have a sales pitch around that branding that sort of reinforces all of the worst stereotypes. They don't get us, they're bureaucratic, they're relentless, that all that stuff. That's not going to get you the outcomes you want.
And you can even soften that a little bit, and I think it would still be relevant. And what I mean by that is you might open up some of those corporate communications, right? You might be exposed to that, and you might not you might not be so cynical to say like, oh, they don't understand me and they're wasting my time and all that stuff. You might just say, oh, they're just doing their jobs, but good thing I've just discovered this is not relevant to me. And so now I'm giving myself permission to ignore it in perpetuity, right? Like the next one that comes in, I already discovered on the last one that it wasn't relevant to me. Like this topic in general isn't relevant to me. So I'm just going to ignore this forever, where a future one might actually be relevant to you, right? And so then it's not a matter of, this kind of conflict where you have this bad taste in your mouth about what this other team is doing at the company. You're just thinking, oh, they're just doing their part of the company, but their role within the company, but it's not relevant to me. So now I'm just going to ignore it, forever. And that is another, I think common outcome for a lot of your employees that are not in this compliance, legal risk kind of function in general.
And so as you've been on your journey of kind of experiencing this stuff and thinking about it, how do you how do you see the challenge? Because you've been through the experience that many of the people that you're talking to won't have. Mm-hmm. By default, it's interesting, and the reason I think it's fascinating to speak to you is the transition of people moving from sales into compliance is pretty limited, right? Because it's not, they're fishing for very different pools of people, and the one doesn't naturally tend towards a career path than the other. Right. So how are you thinking about it? So all the things you say make a lot of sense, right? And they're strong observations. But how are you thinking about sort of transmitting some of these messages and helping people to think about it in those terms? Because it's one thing with you being through it and spotting it. It's quite another getting people who, for very, very good reason in many cases, are not operating in that way. How are you thinking about helping them manage that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think back a little bit, just as a maybe a point of contrast. I think back a little bit to that other startup that I was at before, where we sold to multifamily real estate. A big part of getting them on board with a new technology that was new to the market fundamentally was showing them success of other organizations, right? And saying, hey, here are the results that these other people are seeing with it. And by painting that picture, sometimes you can get people a little bit more comfortable with it, a little bit more bought in, and then eventually they maybe start to incorporate some of those changes themselves. What I have found that is really interesting with Broadcat and some of the principles that I'm talking about right now, which is something these are all things that we espouse, a lot within the Broadcat team, is that none of it is revelatory to people on the other end of the table. What I mean by that is when I talk about how traditional training methods aren't reaching their sales employees or frankly a lot of their other employees, it's never met with, well, can you prove that? It's always met with, yeah, I don't listen to it either. Yeah, that doesn't work on me either. And so what's really interesting to me is that this motion has been a little bit of a learning experience in helping people basically come to terms with things that they might already understand but haven't necessarily recognized or applied in this setting. And then two, being able to admit or like accept within themselves that like their assumption, this this inkling feeling that they've got in their gut is actually correct. It's actually telling them, hey, what you're doing isn't working, and you already know that, but because of prevailing trends and maybe a little bit of fear about repercussions if you change something, you're just not making any changes, right? And so I think that has been a really interesting one where I came into this thinking, oh, I might have to ruffle some feathers and tell people, hey, I think you're wrong here. And what I've been met with instead is, oh yeah, we know this is right, or like this all resonates with us. We wouldn't disagree with any of these observations. But change is hard. And so it's still kind of a gradual process. But I think that has been an extremely interesting dynamic in having now entered this space and come to here. And I think that's a credit a little bit to my boss and what he started, where he's clued in to some of these kind of fundamental observations, and to say, hey, we don't have to do it this other way. We can do it in the common sense way. It just takes people willing to make a change from the norm and the trend.
And I find that really interesting, because if you were to say to somebody in marketing, right, hey, how's that ad campaign working? And they were like, oh, it's terrible. I think it's awful. It's the worst. Like I wouldn't buy that product, right? It just like it doesn't resonate, right? You'd be going, what? You'd be questioning their whole thing. And why are you running campaigns that make your thing look bad?
Exactly.
And I think it's fascinating when you look at compliance is that you do get that often, where people go, yeah, I know. It kind of, that's the way we do things, right? So my job here is to produce something that I kind of know isn't great, right, and I'm not particularly interested in it, but what the hell, right? That's right what I do. And I love that articulation, because I think that is, when one taps into those conversations, that's quite powerful, because actually it's back to that intrinsic motivation, which is the same intrinsic motivation that gets a salesperson who's thinking about a topic and suddenly goes, actually, this is highly relevant to me. Actually, you can tap into that as well if you're in compliance. If you know something isn't right, it's sort of whistleblowing logic in many respects. It's like you kind of. I find it quite liberating to be able to propose solutions to people and go, that thing that's been nagging away at you, that's not you being weird. Actually, there's something behind it, and we need to try and capitalize on that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I've noticed too is some, this is never universal by any means, but some of the people that I talk to who might not agree with the observation so readily, like others will, what I've observed is they also tend to be further removed from the audience that they're trying to reach. So I guess an example of that would be they're having fewer conversations with, or getting less feedback from the audience that they're trying to reach with it. So they might think it's working, but oftentimes it's because they're not actually checking to see if it's working, right? They're not checking to see if it's resonating. I had a group who told me, hey, we want to work with you guys because specifically our managing director asked for the very thing that you give us, right? Your product, because they didn't like the way we were presenting information previously. Right. And then compare that to another group who said, oh, well, we like the way we're doing things now. And then when asked if they ever gather feedback from the business about their communications, they say, oh, well, no, we've never done that before. Right. And so I think that's another component where, and it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is meeting people where they are. If you don't know where your audience is, you're probably going to think you're doing all right. You're probably going to think, oh, I'm checking all the boxes. I'm doing the right things. But that's where you have to first identify where they are and then go meet them and build that bridge backwards.
And it's interesting when you talk about that, because that's kind of what got me on the journey I'm on, which was I found myself in a world where policies were being sent out in my name. Training invitations would go, because there was this kind of like, well, we'll send it from the head of compliance because then it sounds serious, right? Which I think is quite dangerous, right? Because here's another thing packaged from someone that doesn't understand us with a funny job title. But the strange thing was, people used to come to me and they were like, "What's that email you've just sent out?" and I happened to be sat with the business people, so they come to me, and I'm like, and literally a couple of times I just went, "I don't know." And then I'd have to go look, and I'm like, "What is this?" Right? And it wasn't like negligence on my part. Is I hadn't seen it because it was produced by a system. Sure. And it was that pressure. You're absolutely right. It was that pressure where I just kind of went, "I can't do this. Right? I cannot stand behind this thing." but I think it's very easy when you're sitting in a distant world. And that might be a distant location. It might be just that you're particularly now, if it's not, if you're not sort of having to wear the consequences of it, then it's very easy to issue things that theoretically look good that are practically flawed.
Yeah.
You're right. The closer you are to that and the realities of that, and I think one of the things that really got me to think about these things in these terms was the fact that I was forced to do all of the stuff I was telling other people to do. So the compliance function where I was got it. Everything that was imposed on everybody else, so be it training, be it restrictions, be it whatever, was 10 times, was sort of the worst case scenario, right? You must be exemplary in what you do.
Right.
So I was doing a ton more training. And that's what woke me up, because I probably had a worse perspective actually than the average business person.
Sure.
Because I was seeing all these extremities. But it made me just realize, and I was like, if I don't think this is good, then why should they? And that's the point you're making, right? Which is actually, if you start to put yourself in their shoes and think about, is this engaging? If you've clocked it's not engaging and you've clocked it's not going to feel relevant, then you're really praying for a lot to happen for them to have a different perspective on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that gets back to where like a lot of compliance officers will agree with that, right? Where they'll say, "Oh, I wouldn't listen to this either." I think to put, because that's.
I mean, you wouldn't get, if you're in a restaurant, right, and somebody went, "I wouldn't eat here."
Exactly. If the chef,
you kind of say to your server, you just go, "What would you recommend?" Nothing. Do not eat any of this stuff. You'd be out like a shot.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So I had a conversation just last week that really put a pin in that, where they basically said, like, not only would I not listen to it, I'm the one that writes the content and I don't listen to it, right? And that is, to your point, that's the chef saying, I would not eat anything that comes out of my kitchen, right? You will never go there again. I think in what, like, this topic that is now we've touched on here a couple of different questions, is this idea that like you just need a close feedback loop in anything you're doing, right? Whether it's compliance training or sales or like just product development, right? If you're far away from your customers and you don't get customer feedback that says, hey, I really wish your product would do X, Y, and Z instead, then you're never going to build a better product. You're never going to have better compliance training. You're never going to close more contracts as a salesperson. That's just this fundamental idea of close communication helps you make adequate changes and calibrate whatever it is you're doing to an optimal level, right? And it sounds obvious, of course, but we can let ourselves, I get caught up in this too with sales, right? This is not a unique compliance problem. This is just the idea that we get caught up in trends or patterns or habits sometimes. And it's helpful to take a step back, get feedback, and then incorporate that as quickly as we can. And that's this idea in the, particularly in the startup world, is this idea of failing fast. When you're starting a new company, when you're bringing a new product to market, you want to fail fast so that you can make changes and then put it back out the door and get more feedback. And that should be a principle that everybody is looking to incorporate, whether it's sales or compliance teams, is fail fast. Identify the things that are not working. Sometimes that can be as simple as you thinking, oh, I wouldn't listen to this. But then you can build something that you would listen to and put it out the door. And if sales comes back and says, hey, we still don't like this, we still don't think this is relevant, then you can tweak it again. But you've got to have some version of a feedback loop. And ideally, it's got to be a very close feedback loop so that you can make iterations and changes as quickly as possible.
So I think that's a really interesting point, because if you say to someone innovation and compliance, right,
right,
they're not natural bedfellows. Uh-huh. All right. So innovation is something that happens elsewhere within the organization,
right,
because compliance is the serious stuff.
Right.
And I find it interesting because I take the view that because it's so serious, we have to innovate, right? Because we are unlikely to get this right. As we know from most cases of human endeavor, we're unlikely to get it right first time. If we do, we're incredibly lucky. It can happen. But broadly speaking, we have to try things out. We need a bit of trial and error. And I think there is an inbuilt reluctance to do what you've just suggested, because actually, well, we can't afford to do that because, insert excuse here, but it'll be regulators. It's a very serious subject. Right. Our lawyers tell us we can't. We need to look like we know what we're doing. And I think this doesn't help with connecting with the real world and people on the ground, because it looks like you're literally standing there with stone tablets.
Right.
And kind of go, these are the stone tablets with which we communicate our messages.
Yeah.
and maybe that's unfair on stone tablets, but anyway, it's a very static world. It's not one where experimentation seems to be naturally encouraged.
Yeah.
And yet, to me, that seems like a disconnect between the people you're trying to speak to, who are spending their whole time, whether you're a salesperson that's, I'll try this with this. Oh, that didn't work at all. Let me try this. Or going back to people and going marketing, going, do not put one of those ads out again, which had the, that thing on it, right? That's just not resonated with anyone. You need to change that. Or the product is terrible, right? No one's buying it because actually the pricing's wrong or something. But there is some form of R&D, even if you take sales as you need to sell what's here.
Yeah.
There's a feedback loop around how you can do that better.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the bit I find interesting is that the mindset you've just talked about doesn't seem to be prevalent and isn't necessarily encouraged in a compliance space. And yet to get the outcomes you're looking for is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I would agree. And a thought that comes to mind is by no means the proposed solution or anything like that. But I will say that in my time here thus far and working with these teams, I have gained a new level of appreciation for conviction, or like courage of conviction. This idea that if you fundamentally believe a course is the right way to go, then you should pursue it. Right. And because so much of what I see is people saying, oh, I know this doesn't work, but for all the reasons you listed, I'm going to keep doing it anyway. And I really have now this newfound tremendous level of respect for people who will say, I have these reasons why I believe something, and now I'm going to pursue that relentlessly. Right. And until I maybe get new reasons to change my belief or to, go a different route, whatever it is.
Right.
But I really appreciate that. And that's something I've been trying a little bit harder to then embody in sales, where I say, am I doing certain things just because I've seen other salespeople do them? Or am I doing them because I actually think that they will lead to the right outcomes, which is finding the right, target customers and helping bring them on board with Broadcat. And it's an ongoing process, of course, but it's something that I value so much more than I did a year ago before having these experiences.
And I think that's interesting, because when you talk about this sort of level of engagement, I mean, what you are presenting to people, the product is unorthodox in many respects, right? Which is sort of, here's a different way of looking at what you need to achieve, and we can help you be more effective by presenting, just facilitating you to kind of tap into those dynamics. And so it's interesting when you talk in those terms, because it's not just a case of you are supporting them in doing the thing they believe is right. That is your product,
right?
It's intrinsic in what you're selling. Sure. Is a need to encourage that behavior, because if you were selling your product to people who weren't thinking in those terms, they're probably not going to get the most out of it, right? Because they're going to take a very risk-averse approach to adopting it, sure, which probably in many cases means they won't.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And in that sense, I now look at this sales, I guess you might call it a tactic. I look at it a little bit differently now. This idea that, basically using social proof as the selling mechanism to say, hey, you should buy this product or service because all of your peers use it. That can be an effective tool, but now I'm looking at that a little bit differently to say that might not always be the right reason to do something, right? And that gets back to this idea of like, you've got to identify what you think works. And sure, gather a lot of inputs, gather as much information as you can in order to form your opinion of what you think is going to work. But ultimately, if you see a whole bunch of people driving on the wrong side of the road, and then be the one that says, "Hey, guys,
probably the wrong gang to hang out with," right? Because something's probably going to go wrong.
Isn't there? I guess I can't cite any off the top of my head, but I feel like I've heard about different studies that measure this. I don't know what you would call it, maybe a phenomenon of when people see other people in line.
Yeah, this is the classic. My favorite one is the elevator experiment, where you get people to stand the wrong way around in an elevator, exactly, facing the walls, and then people, and they did it in the 60s, and they've tested it again recently. It's the same thing, right? It's like, well, they're all doing it, so it must be the right thing to do.
Exactly. And that's where I have this other idea now, where it's like, sure, if you're trying to sell something, having social proof of a bunch of people standing the other way in the elevator might be an effective way to get them to do it, but you don't want them to do it. Now, I don't want them to do it just because other people are doing it. I want them to do it because they believe it's the right way to do it. And having that social proof is a is a helpful step in a ladder of getting them comfortable with it, rather than being the motivating factor in and of itself.
But it's when you talk in those terms, right? There's this phrase that I've never quite understood, which is best practice.
Sure,
right?
sure.
And I know what it means,
right.
But I don't understand why it's a valued thing, because it sort of suggests that someone has all the answers,
Right?
Okay, we want to be best practice or best in class, right? And I'm kind of going, what happens if the class is full of idiots, right? Why is that a benchmark to aspire to?
Right.
And I'd be looking and saying, how do we do this in the most effective, the smartest way possible?
Right.
And therefore, the benchmarks of what other people are doing is not necessarily right. It's informative, right? But it's not necessarily always relevant. And I do think it's interesting when you talk in the way that you have, which is, if you genuinely know something doesn't feel right, then waiting for everybody else to get to that point is a sort of laggard's game, when actually you want to kind of get ahead of it. And that makes this challenge, I think, a little bit tougher. Because in many respects, many of the things that are starting to happen are people recognizing it's not quite right. But actually, if you push them to the extremities of what they think and went, okay, let's really do this, that would be quite a long way from where we are today in many respects.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way you've just articulated it actually, I think, puts it in a very interesting light, given the discipline of ethics and compliance, where a big part of what they're trying to do is get people to speak up, right? They want people to bring, and so this idea of this idea of saying, well, I'm not going to speak up, I'm not going to make a change until everybody else does. Meanwhile, you're asking employees to say, hey, if you see a group of employees doing something wrong, we want you to speak up. We want you to face the other way in the elevator, but we're not going to do it ourselves, right? I think that puts a different light on it. That's interesting.
Right. No, I love that, because it's literally, we want you to challenge orthodoxy, challenge dumb ideas, dumb thinking, right? But we can't do it with this.
Exactly.
And I would argue it's precisely because of the nature of the activity that you should.
Right. Yeah.
But it is exactly where it really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So, look, I could keep talking to you forever, and I'm sure we're capable of doing it. But if I ask you for sort of parting thoughts for people around your transition and the perspective you've got, any sort of top tips or things that you want to share with people?
Yeah, I think maybe to tie off on one of the subjects we were talking about here at the tail end of the conversation, I would say I would really encourage people to get out and into the business. Get outside of compliance, get outside of legal, and go into the sales teams and the marketing teams and the finance teams and leadership, and really understand what it is they're doing day to day. What is it that concerns them? How do they currently feel about the compliance team? And basically create that feedback loop that we were talking about. I think that would be my highest recommendation, or my strongest encouragement from this conversation, would be start doing that. And I think these other observations will follow. I think you'll start to come to the same conclusions that I did, right? Which is, hey, this outreach is not working for me. I'm not paying attention to it. You'll start to come to those same observations and realizations the way I did, if you start to create that feedback loop for yourself. And I think it's hard. It's very hard to do, to get outside your shell a little bit, but that's, essentially the best way, right? What is it? Growth never happens in your comfort zone.
Right.
You've got to get outside yourself. You got to get outside your sphere in order to gather the information you need in order to be able to make the correct changes within your organization. Because it'll be different for every team, right? It will not always be the same, but it'll never happen, and you'll never get to the correct one without gathering that feedback first.
Amazing. Wow. Well, look, that time has flown. Taylor, thank you, firstly, so much for spending the time to be on the podcast. Secondly, for all the stuff that you're putting out on social media and sharing your thoughts, because I think you've got some incredibly valuable insights. I will put links to Broadcat and to your social media feeds in the show notes so people can find those. But thank you so much for also sparing the time, because you've obviously got a sales job to do as well. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you having me on. This is it. I definitely enjoy having conversations like these. So this was a good time for me. And after this, I'll get back to that job that keeps me so engaged of trying to close deals.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Taylor for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Taylor and the Broadcat, the company he works for, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both of those there. You'll also find links to the previous episodes of this show, where I spoke to Broadcat founder Ricardo Pelafon. Well worth a listen if you've not heard them. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you're not subscribed to the Human Risk newsletter, visit human-risk.com and you can sign up for that there, as well as find lots of other human risk resources. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.